"Officer, that man just stole a Rolls-Royce." The shout cut through the morning air so sharply that dozens of heads turned at once. Conversation stopped. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Even the steady hum of downtown traffic seemed to fade beneath the accusation. Elijah Carter stood beside the black Rolls-Royce Phantom without moving a muscle. The polished body of the luxury sedan reflected the glass walls of Whitmore Holdings Tower, a 40-story building that rose above the city like a monument to wealth and power. Sunlight glimmered across the chrome grille. A cool breeze swept through the plaza, tugging gently at Elijah's dark jacket. He looked nothing like the executives streaming into the building. His shoes were worn but clean. His jacket was simple. No designer logos. No expensive watch flashing from his wrist. Just a tall black man standing quietly beside a car worth more than most homes. Across from him stood Rebecca Whitmore. Her white coat draped perfectly over a tailored business suit. Diamond earrings caught the morning light each time she turned her head. Her expression was sharp, certain, and entirely without doubt. She pointed directly at Elijah. "I saw him get out of that car," she told the growing crowd. "That vehicle belongs to this company." Murmurs spread instantly through the plaza. People slowed their steps. Some stopped completely. Several employees pulled out their phones. One young analyst whispered something to a coworker and received an immediate nod in return. The conclusion seemed obvious to them. Rebecca folded her arms confidently. She had spent years building a reputation as one of the most powerful executives in the company. People listened when she spoke. They trusted her judgment. And at that moment, she looked absolutely convinced she was protecting company property. Elijah said nothing. Not because he was intimidated. Not because he was afraid. He simply watched the reflection of the skyscraper ripple across the Rolls-Royce's flawless paint. A distant siren echoed between the buildings. Growing louder. Closer. Someone in the crowd smiled. Someone else muttered, "Guess he got caught." Rebecca's posture relaxed slightly. She believed the situation was already resolved. The siren stopped. Two police cruisers rolled into the circular driveway at the front of the tower. Their lights flashed silently against the mirrored glass facade. Officers stepped out and approached the scene with measured professionalism. The crowd shifted eagerly, creating space while trying to remain close enough to hear every word. Rebecca immediately stepped forward. "Officers," she said, gesturing toward Elijah. "That's the man. He's standing right next to the company Rolls-Royce." One officer glanced at Elijah, then at the vehicle. "Sir," he said calmly, "would you mind explaining your connection to the car?" For the first time since the accusation began, Elijah moved. Slowly, deliberately. He reached into his jacket pocket. Around him, the plaza seemed to hold its breath. Rebecca's confident smile widened. The phones remained raised. The cameras kept recording. Nobody noticed the faint reflection of a private helicopter passing across the tower's upper windows. Nobody noticed the black SUV turning into the driveway from the opposite side of the block. And nobody, not Rebecca, not the officers, not the crowd, had the slightest idea that within the next few minutes, everything they believed about the man standing beside that Rolls-Royce was about to change. The officer watched carefully as Elijah reached into his jacket. Several people in the crowd leaned forward, eager to see what happened next. Instead of showing panic, Elijah simply removed a leather key holder and placed it in his palm. The black Rolls-Royce responded instantly with a soft flash of its headlights. A quiet electronic chime echoed from the vehicle. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across a few faces in the crowd. Rebecca noticed it too. Her jaw tightened. "That does not prove anything," she said quickly. "Modern key systems can be duplicated." The officer glanced toward her, then back at Elijah. "Sir, do you have identification?" Elijah nodded politely. "Of course." He handed over his driver's license without hesitation. The officer examined it while his partner quietly ran the information through the patrol vehicle system. The plaza settled into an uneasy silence. Above them, sunlight reflected from thousands of glass panels covering the tower. The building looked almost unreal, like a wall of liquid silver stretching into the sky. Elijah looked up at it for a moment. 20 years. 20 years of early mornings, late nights, difficult decisions, and risks that could have destroyed everything. 20 years since he had started with a folding table in a rented office barely larger than a storage room. Nobody standing here knew that story. Nobody recognized the man who had spent decades building businesses across multiple states. That anonymity had never bothered him before. In fact, he preferred it. Elijah had never enjoyed attention. While other executives collected headlines and magazine covers, he quietly funded scholarship programs, invested in struggling neighborhoods, and spent most of his time visiting projects without media cameras nearby. This morning had started like many others. He had flown in before sunrise from a community development conference outside Charlotte. Rather than notifying executives of his arrival, he decided to visit headquarters unannounced. It was something he occasionally did to understand how the company actually operated when senior leadership was not preparing for an inspection. The decision now seemed strangely ironic. Rebecca stood only a few feet away, completely unaware of who she was speaking to. She checked her phone repeatedly while maintaining her confident posture. Employees nearby exchanged whispers. "I heard that car belongs to executive management. Maybe he works for a valet service. Then why is he standing there?" Assumptions multiplied with every passing second. Nobody asked Elijah a single question. Nobody seemed interested in his side of the story. The second officer finally stepped away from the patrol vehicle and approached his partner. He spoke quietly, but the tension in his expression had changed. The crowd noticed immediately. Rebecca noticed too. "Well," she asked, "what did you find?" The officer hesitated before answering. "His identification checks out." Rebecca folded her arms tighter. "That is not the issue. The issue is the vehicle." The officers exchanged another glance. Elijah remained calm. A cool gust of wind swept through the plaza, carrying the scent of fresh coffee from a nearby cafe. Across the street, traffic lights changed and commuters continued their routines, completely unaware of the drama unfolding below the tower. Then something unusual happened. Several employees near the entrance suddenly straightened. Security personnel began speaking urgently into earpieces. Heads turned toward the driveway. A large black SUV had just rolled beneath the front canopy. Its tinted windows reflected the morning sunlight like polished mirrors. One of the officers noticed the reaction immediately. Rebecca turned as well. And for the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. The black SUV came to a smooth stop beneath the entrance canopy, its polished exterior reflecting the towering walls of glass above. The engine went silent. So did much of the crowd. Employees standing near the revolving doors exchanged nervous glances. Security personnel suddenly appeared more alert, their posture shifting from casual observation to quiet attention. Rebecca noticed it immediately. Her confidence remained, but the certainty that had carried her through the confrontation began to crack around the edges. Something about the reaction of the staff felt different. Important. The rear passenger door of the SUV opened. A gray-haired man stepped out wearing a navy suit tailored with understated elegance. Several employees recognized him instantly. Conversations dropped to whispers. The man was Richard Sloan, the chief executive officer of Whitmore Holdings. Seeing him outside during normal business hours was unusual enough. Seeing him arrive unexpectedly was almost unheard of. Richard rarely left the executive floor except for major announcements or emergencies. Rebecca straightened. Relief washed across her face. Surely this would settle everything. She quickly stepped toward him. "Mr. Sloan," she called, offering a professional smile. "Perfect timing. We have a situation involving company property." Richard did not answer immediately. His eyes scanned the plaza, the officers, the crowd, the Rolls-Royce. Then Elijah. The moment his gaze landed on Elijah, something changed. His expression tightened. Not with anger, not with confusion, with concern. Rebecca continued speaking. "The police are handling it. This man was found with the company vehicle." Richard barely seemed to hear her. He took several quick steps forward. Security personnel followed behind him. The crowd watched carefully, sensing that the situation was moving in a direction nobody expected. Elijah remained exactly where he was. Calm, unhurried. The morning breeze lifted the edge of his jacket as sunlight shimmered across the dark paint of the Rolls-Royce beside him. Richard finally stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then the chief executive officer extended his hand. "Good morning, sir," he said respectfully. The plaza froze. Rebecca blinked. Several employees looked at one another in disbelief. One of the officers slowly lowered the notebook he had been holding. Elijah accepted the handshake with a small nod. "Good morning, Richard." The familiarity of the exchange sent another wave of confusion through the crowd. Rebecca stared at them. "You know him?" she asked. Richard turned toward her. His expression remained professional, but there was a visible tension in his eyes now. "Of course I know him." Rebecca laughed softly, expecting clarification. "Then perhaps you can explain why he is standing beside a company vehicle." Silence followed, the kind of silence that seemed to absorb every sound around it. Even the distant city noise felt muted. Richard looked at Rebecca carefully, as though deciding how much to say. Then his attention shifted briefly toward the officers. "Has there been a problem?" he asked. One of them answered professionally. "We received a report concerning possible unauthorized possession of the vehicle." Richard nodded once. The answer appeared to trouble him. Rebecca folded her arms again. "I was simply protecting company assets." Richard inhaled slowly. Behind him, more executives were beginning to emerge from the building. Faces appeared behind the glass entrance. Department directors, senior managers, people who rarely left morning meetings. Their attention focused entirely on the man standing beside the Rolls-Royce. Rebecca noticed that too. For the first time, genuine unease settled into her chest. She looked from Elijah to Richard and back again. The pieces in front of her no longer fit together. Then Richard spoke quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the nearest employees. "Rebecca," he said carefully, "before we go any further, I think there is something important you need to understand." Rebecca felt dozens of eyes settling on her as the silence stretched across the plaza. The confidence that had carried her through the morning suddenly felt heavier, less certain. Around her, employees who had been whispering moments earlier now stood completely still. Even the officers seemed content to wait. Richard Sloan glanced toward Elijah before returning his attention to Rebecca. "The vehicle is authorized," he said calmly. "There is no issue regarding ownership or access." Rebecca frowned. "Then why has nobody seen him before?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Several people nearby shifted uncomfortably. Richard studied her expression carefully. "That is not really the question you should be asking." The words landed softly, but their meaning carried weight. Rebecca felt heat rising into her cheeks. She looked around at the growing audience. More executives had emerged from the building. Some stood beneath the entrance canopy. Others watched from inside the lobby through the massive glass walls. Nobody appeared surprised to see Elijah. That detail disturbed her more than anything else. If these people knew him, why did she not? She was an executive vice president. She attended board meetings. She reviewed quarterly reports. She approved major initiatives. Yet somehow the man standing beside the Rolls-Royce seemed connected to a level of authority she could not see. Elijah remained composed. His hands rested comfortably at his sides. No anger, no smug satisfaction, just patience. The kind of patience that came from experience. A gust of wind swept across the plaza, carrying fallen leaves across the polished stone walkway. Sunlight flashed across the building windows, forcing several people to shield their eyes for a moment. Richard spoke again. "Rebecca, how long have you worked here?" 9 years, she answered immediately. "And during those 9 years, have you ever attended the annual founder presentation?" She blinked. "Of course. Every year." "Yes." Richard nodded slowly. "Then you have seen his name." Confusion crossed her face. She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. Something about the statement struck a distant memory. The annual presentations. The company history videos. The framed photographs displayed throughout headquarters. The founder's story was part of the organization's identity. Employees learned it during orientation. Executives referenced it constantly. Yet the face connected to that story was rarely discussed. Most people assumed the founder remained a distant figure focused on private investments and philanthropy. Rebecca swallowed hard. Her gaze drifted toward Elijah again. For the first time, she truly looked at him. Not at his clothes. Not at the Rolls-Royce. At him. The calm confidence. The quiet posture. The complete absence of fear despite standing at the center of public scrutiny. Suddenly, several details began fitting together in ways she did not like. One of the officers cleared his throat. "Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding." Nobody answered. The crowd seemed suspended between two realities. The one they believed an hour ago, and the one beginning to reveal itself now. Richard stepped slightly aside, allowing an unobstructed view between Rebecca and Elijah. The movement felt intentional, almost symbolic. Rebecca's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. The question carried none of the certainty from before, only confusion. Elijah looked at her for a moment. The city noise returned in distant layers. Traffic, car horns, the low hum of construction several blocks away. Yet inside the plaza, everything felt strangely still. Then Elijah offered a small, polite smile. Before he could answer, another black vehicle pulled beneath the canopy. Several members of the board of directors stepped out together. The moment they saw Elijah, every one of them immediately changed direction and began walking toward him. Rebecca stared at Elijah as though seeing him for the first time. The sounds of the city seemed distant now, reduced to a faint hum beyond the walls of glass and steel surrounding the plaza. Her attention fixed on the man standing beside the Rolls-Royce. The founder, the chairman, the person whose signature appeared on every major document she had reviewed for years. The realization settled heavily over the crowd. Employees who had arrived expecting an ordinary workday now stood motionless beneath the morning sun. Nobody whispered anymore. Nobody laughed. Nobody reached for explanations. The truth had finally arrived, and it required none. Elijah glanced toward the bronze plaque mounted above the entrance. Sunlight reflected across the engraved letters before falling back onto the plaza below. Then he looked at Rebecca. His expression remained calm. There was no anger in his eyes, no desire to embarrass her, only a quiet sadness that seemed older than the moment itself. Richard Sloane stepped forward and addressed the officers. "There has clearly been a misunderstanding," he said. "Mr. Carter is the founder and majority owner of Whitmore Holdings." The words landed with the weight of certainty. One officer exhaled slowly. The other nodded, immediately understanding the situation. Around them, several employees lowered their eyes. Others stared openly at Elijah, struggling to reconcile the humble man before them with the image of a billionaire chairman. Rebecca felt her throat tighten. She remembered every assumption she had made, every conclusion she had reached before asking a single question, every confident statement delivered in front of dozens of witnesses. The memory of those moments now felt painfully sharp. Elijah finally spoke. His voice was steady and clear. "I visit our locations often without notice." Nobody interrupted. "I do it because reports only tell part of the story. Buildings do not tell the story. Numbers do not tell the story. People do." A light breeze moved through the plaza, stirring loose leaves along the stone walkway. The board members listened carefully. So did the employees. "This morning," Elijah continued, "I learned something important." Rebecca lowered her gaze. She already knew what was coming. Yet Elijah surprised her. "I learned that many people here acted professionally." He nodded toward the officers. They asked questions before making conclusions. Then he glanced toward several security staff members who had remained calm throughout the incident. Others followed procedure. His eyes eventually returned to Rebecca. The silence stretched. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. "And I learned how quickly assumptions can become facts in the minds of good people." Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. The words carried no accusation, which somehow made them more powerful. Elijah reached into his jacket and removed a small access card. The black lettering across the front caught the sunlight. "Chairman, founder, Whitmore Holdings." Several employees inhaled sharply. The final piece of doubt disappeared. The crowd stood frozen. The board members exchanged knowing glances. Richard Sloane folded his hands quietly. Rebecca looked at the card, then at Elijah. The truth was undeniable now. The man she had publicly accused was not merely connected to the company. He was the company. The morning air felt suddenly cooler. Above them, the mirrored tower reflected the sky like a sheet of silver glass. And beneath that reflection, an entire plaza stood silent as the full weight of the revelation settled over everyone at once. Rebecca stood motionless as the plaza slowly began to breathe again. The silence that had settled over everyone remained, but it was no longer the silence of confusion. It was the silence that follows certainty. The truth was now visible to every person standing there. The officers stepped back respectfully. Employees lowered their phones. Board members exchanged quiet words among themselves. Yet Rebecca barely noticed any of it. Her attention remained fixed on Elijah. The chairman's identification card was no longer in his hand. He had already slipped it back into his jacket as if it were something ordinary. That simple gesture affected her more than the revelation itself. Most people would have displayed it proudly. Most people would have used it as a weapon. Elijah had used it only to clarify the truth. Nothing more. Rebecca looked down at the polished stone beneath her feet. The reflection of the tower stretched across the surface like liquid glass. For the first time in years, she felt genuinely small. Not because she had lost authority. Not because she had been proven wrong. Because she finally understood the question she should have asked herself from the beginning. Why had she been so certain? She replayed the morning in her mind. The Rolls-Royce. The simple jacket. The unfamiliar face. The immediate conclusion. The answer became impossible to avoid. She had judged the situation before gathering facts. She had decided who belonged and who did not. The realization settled heavily on her shoulders. Richard Sloane remained nearby, giving her space. The board members did the same. Nobody rushed her. Nobody humiliated her. That restraint made the moment even more difficult. Rebecca slowly stepped forward. The movement drew the attention of several people nearby. She stopped a few feet from Elijah. Her voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard it. "Mr. Carter," she said. The title felt unfamiliar on her tongue. "I owe you an apology." The morning breeze moved gently through the plaza. A few loose leaves rolled across the stone between them. Elijah listened without interrupting. Rebecca swallowed hard. "I convinced myself I was protecting the company." She paused. "But the truth is that I never gave you the chance to explain anything." Her eyes briefly dropped before meeting his again. "I made assumptions. I should not have." Nobody spoke. The employees watching from the entrance remained completely still. Even the traffic sounds beyond the property seemed distant. Elijah studied her for a moment. Then he nodded once. Not a dramatic gesture. Not a triumphant one. Simply acknowledgement. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. Rebecca blinked. She had expected disappointment. Perhaps criticism. Instead, she found calmness. Elijah looked toward the building rising behind them. Sunlight reflected from the upper floors, casting silver patterns across the plaza. "The easiest thing in the world is to judge a person from a distance," he said quietly. "It takes more effort to understand them." The words settled over the crowd. Several employees lowered their eyes. Others appeared deep in thought. Elijah continued. "This morning is not important because of who I am." He glanced briefly toward the tower. "It is important because the same thing can happen to someone who has no title, no position, and no voice." Rebecca listened carefully. Every word felt directed not only at her, but at everyone standing there. Elijah offered a small smile. It was neither cold nor dismissive. It carried the warmth of someone who had learned long ago that bitterness solves very little. "Mistakes do not define people," he said. "What they learn from them does." The plaza remained silent. Yet the tension that had dominated the morning was finally beginning to dissolve, replaced by something far more powerful: understanding. For several seconds, nobody moved. The plaza stood wrapped in a strange stillness, as though the entire morning had finally reached its destination. Sunlight spilled across the glass walls of headquarters, turning the building into a mirror that reflected the city back onto itself. Employees remained gathered near the entrance. The officers quietly returned to their vehicles. Board members exchanged respectful nods before heading toward the lobby. One by one, the tension that had gripped the plaza began to fade. Elijah looked toward the towering structure he had spent decades building. The reflection of clouds drifted slowly across its surface. Time had changed the company. It had grown larger than he ever imagined. New leaders had arrived. New employees had joined. Entire careers had begun inside those walls. Yet in that moment, he was reminded that every organization, no matter how successful, was still made of people. And people always had something to learn. Richard Sloane stepped beside him. "The board is waiting upstairs," he said quietly. Elijah smiled faintly. "They can wait another few minutes." Richard nodded. He understood. Rebecca still stood nearby. The weight she carried looked different now. Less like fear, more like reflection. She glanced toward the employees who had witnessed everything. Some offered polite smiles. Others simply returned to their work. Nobody seemed interested in extending her embarrassment. The lesson had already been learned. Elijah turned toward her one final time. "Rebecca." She looked up immediately. "Yes, sir." The title came naturally now, but there was something else in her voice. Humility. Elijah nodded toward the entrance. "Lead the meeting this afternoon." Surprise crossed her face. "Sir." Richard looked equally puzzled. Elijah's smile widened slightly. "You care deeply about this company." That much was obvious. Rebecca opened her mouth, uncertain how to respond. Elijah continued, "Leadership is not about never making mistakes. It is about recognizing them quickly enough to grow from them." The words settled softly between them. Rebecca felt emotion tighten her throat. She nodded once. "I will remember that." Elijah believed her. He could see it in her eyes. The plaza had become quieter now as employees filtered back into the building. The city resumed its rhythm around them. Traffic moved through intersections. Distant sirens echoed several blocks away. Somewhere nearby, a coffee cart reopened after the unexpected interruption to its morning business. Life continued. Elijah walked toward the entrance. Security personnel opened the doors. Board members waited respectfully inside the lobby. As he crossed the threshold, sunlight followed him briefly across the marble floor before fading behind the glass. Rebecca remained outside for a moment longer. Her gaze drifted upward. High above the entrance, the bronze plaque caught the light. Beneath the founder's inscription sat the familiar signature she had overlooked countless times before. Now it seemed impossible to miss. A gentle breeze moved through the plaza. The leaves that had gathered near the walkway lifted and scattered across the stone. Rebecca watched their movement for a few seconds, then slowly exhaled. Behind the glass walls, Elijah disappeared into the elevator lobby, surrounded by executives and directors. Yet there was no triumph in the scene. No celebration. No revenge. Only quiet dignity. The doors closed softly. The reflection of the city returned to the glass. And beneath the silver shine of the tower, the silence that remained no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt like justice.